Hello and welcome to this Infosecurity Magazine webinar. My name's James Coker, reporter at Infosecurity Magazine, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's session, which is sponsored by CyberGRX, Telstra Purple and Telstra Ventures. So for the next 60 minutes, we're going to be discussing supply chain security, easing the headache of third-party risk assessments. Before I introduce you to our panel of speakers, there's just a couple of quick housekeeping points from me. We'll be running some polls throughout the session, so please do join in with those as and when they appear. No right or wrong answers on those, we're just very interested to get your views. Also, please do use the submit a question function to let us know of any questions you might have, and also let us know if a question is for a particular presenter, and we'll do our best to answer those later on in the session. And finally, for those of you on Twitter, our hashtag is InfosecWebinar, so please do feel free to join in the discussion on social media as well. And just a quick note about CPE credits. This webcast qualifies listeners for 1 CPE credit based on a minimum attendance time of 50, that's 50 minutes. So once you've done that, you can download your certificate from your Infosecurity account and submit it. And further instructions can be found on the event platform. And please note, certificates take 48 hours to be processed and will be made available to download the following day. So before we head on with the session, I'll just introduce our speakers for today. We have Manoj Bhatt, who is Head of Cybersecurity and Advisory at Telstra Purple, Max Dalziel, who is Strategic Account Director at CyberGRX, and Christian Toon, who is CISO at Pinsent Masons. So a really great panel to talk about this very important topic. So to start with, I'm just going to kick off our first poll question of the afternoon, which is, has your organisation experienced data losses arising from a security breach at a third-party supplier in recent years? And the options for this are A, yes, more than one, B, yes, one, C, no, or D, not sure. So I've just opened up voting on that, so please do get your votes in. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Max, who's going to be giving us an opening presentation. Over to you, Max.
Thank you very much, James. So the presentation is Supply Chain Security, Easing the Headache of Third-Party Assessments. Right, so why is it such a headache to assess third parties or vendors? And let's unpack that a little more. Why is it such a headache for the companies that conduct them? And why are they such a headache for companies that respond to them? Well, the answer to that can be partially explained when we consider that at the center of every world-class cyber third-party risk management program is data. But acquiring assessment data, it's difficult, time-consuming, and incredibly labor-intensive, particularly when you're using spreadsheets as your data collection tool and a one-to-one data acquisition model. It takes time to identify who your third parties are. It takes time to determine which vendors to assess and why. In other words, to determine their inherent risk, and time to determine what level of assessment to conduct. Then you need to actually get the assessment completed, and in many cases, get those responses validated. In other words, validate that the assertions the vendor made are correct. Trust but verify. But it doesn't end there. You then need to analyze the assessment responses, keep the assessment data up to date, calculate their residual risk, and finally, manage that risk on a continuous basis. That sounds like a migraine to me. To quantify this, consider that on average, it takes between 20 to 30 hours to get one assessment completed. And when you look at it from the vendor's perspective, you'll also find a huge operational burden associated with answering bespoke due diligence questionnaires. ADP, the payroll company, for example, was assessed over 6,000 times in 2020. It's not going to come to any surprise when I share that our research shows that most organizations are asking the same questions, but in a slightly different way. And just a final thought on this. 81% of respondents to a recent report compiled by Cynthia Institute on behalf of Risk Recon admit they rarely require remediation from third parties after an assessment. And I'll just let that sit for a second, right? 4 out of 5 companies do absolutely nothing with the data, right? So how are companies trying to ease this headache for themselves and their business partners, i.e. their vendors? Companies are looking for solutions that give them that time back. In the risk management space, there are multiple types of solutions that are all competing for your pound or your euro or your dollar. Solution providers, in my opinion, that have completely confused the market in this area. Now, while many of these solutions are competing for the same budget, they really aren't competitors at all. So in the remaining minutes, I'll try and break down the difference between the exchange, GRC platforms, ratings, platforms as a service, and consulting providers before opening the conversation back up. Okay, so before I get going, the first question to ask yourself, or whoever controls your budget, is this: do I want a solution to help me do this myself, or do I want someone else to do this for me? In the do I want to do this myself category, you have the governance, risk, and compliance, the GRC platforms that provide the essential forms and data structure to manage any type of risk discipline. In the box, there will be a risk register, control framework, assessment management functionality, both internal or external, issues management of some kind, and probably some workflow and dashboards. You're going to have to hire some consultants to help implement this, and you'll have to come up with your own content for your assessments, risk register, and control framework. To me, this sounds a little bit like IKEA, right? You will end up with a table, but you're going to have to put it together yourself. Then you have the platforms as a service. Think IKEA again, but in this case, instead of table parts coming in a box, you get some glue, a saw, etc. PaaS solutions will have all the essential application components, for example, blank forms that you can configure, such as workflow templates, reports, alerts, and more. You have to build a whole solution from scratch before you can start assessing your vendors, but you have guidance. In the get someone to do it for me bucket, we've got the consultants, right? And you can hire a consultant to do just about anything. Now, if you hire consultants to perform risk assessments, I suggest you get comfortable. Anything that gets paid by the hour is diametrically opposed to efficiency. This is going to be your most customizable solution and also the most expensive. If you conduct more than 100 assessments a year, you need to be ready to pay a premium, right? Then we've got the ratings companies. These guys scan the outside perimeter of your vendor's network to see if they get the quote unquote good housekeeping seal of approval, right? It's effectively a fast, high level binary thumbs up or thumbs down. This can produce false positives and will likely not show the full view of risk that a vendor poses. Kind of like buying a house based on its curb appeal, without getting an appraisal on the nitty-gritty details of the house itself, you know, the structural integrity, building materials, age, mold, etc. Right? And finally, you have the exchange. Now, the exchange models are not new. Two-sided marketplaces have been around for a long time. Think eBay, right? Exchanges bring buyers and sellers together for mutual benefit. In the third-party cyber risk management context, the exchange will usher vendors through a standardized cybersecurity risk assessment, and then will provide that data to enterprises who want a validated assessment on their vendors. This model is the most efficient way to assess your vendors. It allows vendors to make broader utility of the assessment task, which everyone hates, believe me. Instead of having to repeatedly answer the bespoke questionnaire coming out of the GRC platform or the PaaS solution, the assessment is already there. Just click share. All these solutions are driving to the same conclusion. They aim to tell you what risks a vendor will expose you to, but they all do it in a very different way. So CyberGRX is an exchange, and our big idea is to combine structured assessment data with threat intelligence data and to map it back to the MITRE attack framework. So let me walk you through what it's like managing cyber third-party risk on CyberGRX, right? Well, it's a simple 6-step process, right? Step number one, step number one here is upload. The process starts after you upload a list of your vendors. All we need is the company name and the URL. And this is when the first piece of valuable information comes. You will immediately see which of your vendors have already completed a CyberGRX assessment and at which tier, right? Step two is the calculation of inherent risk. Traditionally, identifying inherent risk required working with multiple business relationship managers to determine how each third party is actually used. Not anymore. Our inherent risk insights, which we call AIR, automates this step by pre-populating 8 inherent risk questions with crowdsourced data from the exchange on how other companies on the exchange use that vendor or similar vendors. And you can accept those crowdsourced responses or edit them to make them bespoke to your organization. And this piece of functionality is really helpful when we're dealing with remediation or backlog projects. So in other words, we help you quantify the impact that a cyber event on this vendor would have on your business. The other element that gets factored into your inherent risk score is the likelihood of a cyber event happening to that vendor. And that's a step that we also calculate for you via a number of threat intelligence feeds. And I'm going to quickly list them out. We've got a business classification feed. We have risk recon data. We've got recorded future data, a cyber incident archive, threat intelligence feed, and a MITRE attack framework. So day one, you will know who your high, medium, and low risk vendors are and why. And you'll have a risk-based methodology to gain insight into who to prioritize, and a risk-based methodology to gain insight into which type of assessments to order. So let's order. Step 3. Now that we know which vendors inherently present high, medium, or low cybersecurity risk, we can decide which level of assessment is appropriate. So there are 2 scenarios here, right? We already have a completed and in-date assessment waiting on the exchange. We do not have a completed and in-date assessment waiting on the exchange. If we do, then all you need to do is request permission to access the data. And we're on track to have 10,000 completed cybersecurity assessments on the exchange by the end of the year. So there is a very high probability that we have a lot of completed assessments on your vendors today. Now, if we do not, then you will use our assessment as a service, right? And the bottom line here is that we go out and we do the beating and chasing for you. We have a team of qualified assessment coordinators who reach out to the third party with training, onboarding, support, objection handling, follow-up, and provide an understanding of the exchange model. And we've got 3 assessment tiers that differ in the granularity of questions and 4 levels of validation: on-site, remote, rules-based, and self-attested. The CyberGRX assessment framework and controls are based on NIST 800-53 version 4 and ISO 27001 frameworks, and influenced by over 20 standards, including PCI DSS 3.2 and CIS critical security controls, with the bulk of the assessments focused on asking questions about the maturity and effectiveness of the third-party cybersecurity controls. And the basic structure of our assessments revolves around only asking multiple choice and click box questions that can be delegated, which means that we only capture structured data, which in turn allows us to align that structured data to kill chains and allows our customers to slice and dice that data and apply analytics. Okay. So in step 4, our customers are able to track the progress of their assessment of the audit assessments on the exchange. In step 5, they're actually receiving these assessments. They have access to these the content for 12 months with a breakdown of the top risks that are bespoke to you and driven by your impact responses, the threat landscape, and MITRE attack framework. And finally, the 6th step is obviously continuously monitoring the changes in your third-party ecosystem. So before you head to the car lot to kick tires, my recommendation is to determine if you would much rather hop on a high-speed train or build your own car. So with that, over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Max. Really interesting presentation there about some of the current issues surrounding third-party risk assessments. I'm just going to take a look at our answers to the first poll question, which was, has your organisation experienced data losses arising from a security breach at a third-party supplier in recent years? So just over half said no, 51%. This was followed by not sure, 27%. 12% said yes, one. And 8% said yes, more than one. So it's quite interesting responses. Max, I was just wondering if I could get your thoughts on those results there.
I guess I'm a little bit surprised as the number was so high for people who haven't, been subjected to a third-party incident to date. But I'd certainly be interested to hear from those who have, and what kind of incident they experienced. So if there's any feedback on that, it'd be interesting to hear. Absolutely.
So before we head on with the rest of the discussion, I'm just going to launch the second poll question of the afternoon, which is, what is the most important factor in assessing the security of third-party suppliers? And so the options for this are A, ensuring data protection rules are adhered to, B, concerns over the potential impact of supply chain attacks following SolarWinds, C, concerns about other supply chain attacks carried out in recent years, D, ensuring customers or investors are satisfied with your organization's overall security approach, or E, other. So I'll just put that live now. We just had a question coming from the audience asking if the slide deck will be available to download. It won't, but the session will be on demand afterwards, so you'll be able to access Max's presentation again going via there if you'd like.
James, I'll just jump in as well. I mean, if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'd be more than happy to connect and share content with you. That's absolutely fine.
Excellent. And just a quick reminder, you can submit any questions you've got for our panel via our question function. So to kick off the discussion, I'd just like to talk a little bit more about the threats posed to third parties over recent years, and obviously the growing obligations of organizations to ensure their supply chains are secure. So Manoj, if I could start with you, in what ways have we seen cyber attackers look to target third parties over recent years, and how has this threat been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think interestingly, I think more and more threats are certainly hitting the supply chain. I think they've always been there in reality. I think what's really coming to the forefront, and I think there'll be a number of CISOs, a number of security professionals, you tend to look at your own organization first and then work throughout your third parties. And I think that we're seeing is a maturing piece in the marketplace at the moment. But I think, yeah, absolutely. I don't even think it's just about third parties. I think during the last year and the pandemic, we've seen a huge amount of threats increasing. I'm sure people can relate to phishing attacks. There's a huge amount of phishing attacks that have started to happen. So I think it's across the board. And I think third-party engagement is really something that, and third-party supplier assessments is something that's really growing as an industry for some sectors. And I say some sectors, I know we've got Christian on as well, who will certainly talk about the legal sector. I think there are some sectors that are more mature than others. And I think areas like finance and particularly legal have been doing a lot more around this in two ways. We're certainly seeing a big trend in things like retail, for instance, really starting to take off and growing in this kind of third-party supplier assessment piece.
Thanks, Manoj. And just sort of leading on from your comments there, Christian, if I could come to you, how's kind of the importance of third-party assessments grown in the legal sector that you've seen from your position at Pinsent Masons?
So from our experience, I think it's always been important. I think firstly, both the work that law firms and professional services business get involved in is very sensitive of nature. It's often high value, so it kind of makes us a right target. Historically, I think the profession has relied on the kind of the regulated nature of the profession to sort of safeguard the confidentiality, the trust and integrity with the people that you're dealing with. And of course, the sort of the modern world in which we operate now, it's almost a kind of immaterial point, because there are additional things that kind of go way beyond the solicitor's regulatory authority of kind of conduct of its kind of members. So we also then find ourselves at the end of a lot of kind of supply chains. So not just in our own risk management here to ensure that we're kind of doing what needs to be done, but actually when we're kind of serving international business and making sure that we're kind of doing everything they're expecting, the challenges are kind of very much front and center for us, because at one end you've got organizations wanting to come and kind of asking for us to give 30 days worth of assessment time to their annual assessment process, where they'll be kind of using a kind of Big Four consulting group to come in and kind of kick the tires on us to the consulting point that Max mentioned, all the way through to if you actually find yourself working with a lot of kind of large international organizations, you very quickly have their own flavor of expectation. It's not like kind of ISO's enough, Cyber Essentials, or aligning to a particular framework. Everyone wants you to do certain things in a certain way, and then actually trying to deliver on all of that to meet their expectations. A great example, and something we had to deal with historically, on one side of the fence, we had a client that wanted us to change passwords every 90 days. Then we had every 60 days from somebody else. And then we didn't, from another client, they didn't want expiry at all. So where do you go with that? Of course, you kind of want to engage and support. You want their business ultimately, because without them, kind of the security model's kind of a waste of time. So trying to manage those expectations is very difficult. And finding ourselves in that sort of position where we need a response that not only meets their expectations, but can also deal with ours.
And I think, Christian, just to feed back into some of that, I think it's interesting because we're creating a bit of an industry. And you know, you will have seen some of the questionnaires and surveys, things like, do you have DLP? You know, I mean, it's such a generic term around data loss prevention. And do we mean it at the network level or the endpoint level, or what do you really mean? And I think as we grow and more people are doing assurance around this, we're creating a bit of an industry for ourselves. We're taking the frameworks and actually going, well, I know the framework, like I think, Max, you referenced 853, very important, but let me take every control out of 853 and it becomes a full-time industry, right? Where we're actually taking it away from what we should be doing, which is about managing risk.
Yeah, I think for the last 3 years, we've seen it kind of explode in importance for boards and organizations across the globe with the breaches that have kind of sort of been mentioned. But I think we're still caught in a kind of compliance kind of approach for this sort of stuff, and it's broken. There used to be, once upon a time, you get yourself an ISO certificate, whether you've downloaded it or earned it and had it audited, and that should have been enough. It's like, yeah, we don't care. You've got that, great, tick in the box. Tell me about all the other stuff you're doing. I know organizations that have even gone to the lengths of SOC 1 and SOC 2 reporting. Yeah, that's great, but now tell me, fill in my Excel spreadsheet. I want to know more. It's almost there's never enough. And it's really challenging on putting a response in that is proportionate to the workload and risk that your organization faces.
Yeah, just kind of quickly add on to that. I mean, everybody I've taught, I mean, you can imagine I've talked to hundreds of companies over the years, right? And I think that the vast majority of people that I've spoken to realize that there is a more efficient and effective way to go about collecting data, right? But people are always resistant to change, right? You've got to have some stamina, right? You've got to have, you need to be an evangelist, right? To kind of push back and go, look, I get it. We've been doing this for many years now, and it's working, but it could be better, right? And I'm going to champion this. I'm going to take responsibility to make that, to make this easier for us as a consumer of data. And I'm also going to try and make this easier for my partners, right? Sometimes vendors, I feel get looked at as adversaries, right? It's their business partners, right? They are doing something better or more cost effectively than you can do yourself, right? So, it does take some effort. There's no question about it. It's not abracadabra, wave a magic wand, and you have a new, improved strategy and tool set, etc. It does take time, and it takes and it requires somebody to be an evangelist and take the charge. It's not.
Yeah, it's taken us about 3 years to get where we are now. From kind of 2017, we had about 7,000 entities in our supply chain that we didn't know too much about. Now we kind of sit here with a kind of small focused team specifically on supply chain risk that deal with our downstream suppliers, so our third parties, but are also kind of in parallel working upstream with our clients to kind of sort of validate that. And that's been a hard slog in defining our methodology, our tolerance for risk, client acceptance, market acceptance, etc. So this isn't an overnight fix. This is part of a longer play.
Yeah, absolutely. Manoj, just on that kind of point, are you seeing organisations across many different sectors kind of realising that risk assessment of third party needs to be a lot more than just that kind of tick box exercise?
I think, yeah, they are. I think what's really interesting that I'm seeing is smaller organizations. We see a lot of our customers who are small organizations who have some very large, big corporates. And what they're finding is it's one survey a year and it's growing to 2 or 3 surveys. Then it's the audits and it's growing organically into something that's then unmanageable. So, and I think I'm sure Christian's got some tips around what to do when you're at the start of that journey. But interestingly for them, we're starting to see that actually it's going to get worse. I think it's going to get bigger and bigger as an industry. And before we know it, we're going to have, again, we're working with a CRM organization that works with retailers, big retailers. And as part of that, the big retailers are now talking about this at a board level. So they have full-blown security teams creating these questionnaires, sending it to this small CRM organization who are trying to do their best. And we're seeing that replicated across all the different sectors now. So those sectors that necessarily might not have had the same level of maturity as other sectors, we're seeing that growing across the board. And as that does grow, we're going to be an industry of just sending questionnaires around constantly, people auditing. And I think that's going to become an industry in itself, as I've alluded to before. So I think that's the fear that I have, is if we don't do something as an industry to try and get this under some sort of control and recognize certifications, recognize the due diligence, what people do as part of their own internal audit processes, but also understanding risk. And I think that's the key thing here, is don't just assess everyone. I know we typically have a tiered approach, most organizations do, but actually it's just understanding that risk and understanding what's really important. And I'm sure, Christian, you've got some tips maybe for organizations that are starting on this journey or are exploring it really for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to agree with you. That's the kind of target state, but I don't think we're going to get there. There's too much commercial sensitivity for organizations to get together. It's been a real painful journey to try and get, I guess, clients, supply chain to kind of club together. And everyone's going to have a different risk appetite for this. So I think the best you can look to do is to look at bringing efficiencies into the process, because I'd love to say in my lifetime, I'd love to see that. I don't think it's going to happen because we're two different organizations, are too particular in their approach, even at an industry level, from a financial perspective, that have it together on so many other levels around cyber. That their kind of varying degrees of assessment and approach is mind-boggling. It really is. And to even to get them to come together on this area, I mean, yeah, great if somebody could do that. It's clearly more successful than I will ever be.
Yeah, but Chris, it will surprise you that CyberGRX can help with that particular challenge. We have a tool called the Framework Mapper, which allows you to leverage our framework and then export the yeses and nos, if you will, within a framework or a regulatory lens of choice. So we can actually map our responses back to, if you're an ISO shop or a NIST shop, we can actually map our responses back to that particular framework, or, as I said, a bespoke Pinsent Mason's framework, for example.
Yeah, which sounds fantastic. I guess the challenge we come across is that kind of in our supply chain, both up and downstream, people are using different tools and technologies, or there's a proprietary methodology to assess X, and that's happened to be different to the other methodology that's over here. So we're constantly chasing multiple providers, and it's almost like we need to see some regulation in this space to actually kind of drive a single consistent lens that allows everybody to do what's important. To your point there about risk, everyone will have different appetites and different ways to kind of approach on this. So we need a central way to do it. Otherwise, it will just perpetuate this challenge of implementation, but also the industry will just explode, as it's probably starting to do, if not already.
Just before we move on from that, I just wanted to ask you guys about you mentioned sort of regulations there, Christian, but obviously the growth in data protection legislation that we've seen around the world in recent years, and how that's kind of starting to place kind of additional responsibilities on organizations to assess the security of third-party suppliers. So Manoj, if I could start with you, what have we kind of seen in recent years in that respect?
I think Max alluded to it on his slides. Actually, it's about data, isn't it? And data is really taken off. I think we're starting to see more and more data being used in the industry across the board. I think in all organizations, all companies. I'm sure somebody's got a stat around the volume of data that's being used in today versus 5 years ago. I think that has a value, and I think that's what's really interesting, is that data is becoming valuable, and I think people are really recognizing the value of data, and I think that's different from sector to sector. I think, as you alluded to, Christian, particularly in the legal sector, that data, I'm giving my data over to somebody, I want to make sure that it's going to be okay. And that's across the board, and we're seeing not only value of data as in the traditional sense, we're seeing things like IoT devices and 5G devices, and the telemetry that you can take off these things, it's going to grow. So I think we're seeing across the board more and more value being put onto data, and making sure the security controls are correct for the data that is being used. So I think that's going to continue to grow, and I think that's a positive step. I think we're now starting to really understand, we've heard the term crown jewels. It's not always about the crown jewels. Sometimes it's about your processes as well. So I think we're taking a much more mature view of what that means from a data perspective.
Thank you, Manoj. That's really interesting. So before we move on, I just want to check our responses to our second poll question, which was, what is the most important factor in assessing the security of third-party suppliers? So the option with the most votes was ensuring data protection rules are adhered to, which was 41% of those polled. This was followed by concerns about the potential impact of supply chain attacks following SolarWinds, which was 21%. Next was ensuring customers or investors are satisfied with your organization's overall security approach, which was 17%. Other was 11%, and concerns about other supply chain attacks carried out in recent years was 7%. Perhaps, Christian, if I could come to you, if you've got any initial thoughts on those results?
Yeah, I was looking to vote on this one, but I don't think you can as a presenter. Because I was going to.
No, sadly not. No.
Yeah. All of that is really important. I don't think there is a most important factor. And I think probably the 11% that went with other was probably captured in there, because kind of depending on which part of the year you're in, kind of what's been breached and what stories in the press, all of that should be important. And it's about factoring that into that assessment process. Again, kind of working out what's important for you and your organization. Actually, is it the kind of SolarWinds type attacks that really needs to be up there? Yeah, okay, it probably is, but you should also be looking at kind of customers, stakeholder kind of board satisfactions, etc. So I think it all needs to get kind of roped into the view of, well, look, what are you concerned about with regards to your third parties? And that may be third or fourth party risks as well. And I know there's a question on that as well. But for us, and we kind of have had to almost look at focusing less on the suppliers and more on the data, because otherwise we kind of get swamped. So we start following the information. and then it's the information that we're then interested in. So we do our element of due diligence. That's kind of one part, as you would expect from contractual expectations, or certainly from a regulatory interest, to say, well, look, how have you validated these people you're working with? But we've had to go one step further, because for our risk profile, we need to know where stuff might fall out the organization or fall out of the third or fourth parties we're using. And we'll all know that when we've seen this happen, it's often the third party gets breached and the third party probably hasn't a clue as to kind of what's actually gone on. That there's been stories around the industry where kind of monitoring has happened, and actually that monitoring has been really good and proactive, that it's picked up those poor configurations, less on the breach side, but that kind of enabled that organization to speak with that third party and then work out what's going on. Or indeed, more recently, a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine at another complete outside of the sector, a big international media business, someone in their supply chain would sort of inadvertently taken some photos of their home office setup that also included passwords and proprietary systems and everything else, thinking they're just talking about the kind of the working environment, and isn't it great to be able to do all this sort of stuff at home? So in their view, quite innocently, but kind of went against a lot of policy and control. So it's an ongoing challenge for us, but the assessment piece, yes, is only then a snapshot, but you need to look at whether or not you feel a further level of monitoring is required.
Yeah. Hey, can I just add something quickly?
Yeah,
into that? Just James, go back to the question a second. Can you go back a slide? I just want to make sure that.
Sure.
Because the most important factor in assessing security, I mean, I was just thinking that what's missing, potentially another one that's missing there is just having a good contract in place, right? And a contract that includes the right to audit, right? Because I have conversations with customers, and they kind of, the feedback's always the same, right? That a supplier or a vendor, they're always motivated to respond to questionnaires and to provide information when you're onboarding them. But, a year into that contract, on a multi-year contract, they're slightly less motivated to get back to you in a timely fashion. I would, again, I said probably this one for Chris, right? Just, I would, it sounds to me that, the companies that have the right to audit in their contract and have these terms pre-agreed upon are in a better position to manage that risk on an ongoing basis. So, that was just a thought. I don't know if that's shared or supported.
I think, Max, just to add to that, I think you're right. I think the amount of times we've spoken to organizations and that, we've kind of said, well, what policies have you provided to your third parties who can, flow down? I think there's a very valid question and point around fourth parties as well. And what does that contractual flow down look like? And a lot of organizations saying, well, our policies are not in the greatest of situations. Which means if you're not in a great situation, how can you then expect your third parties to be in that compliance mode around what they should be doing as well?
Yeah, and then you can't be too heavy-handed, right? I mean, I was talking to one of our customers the other day, and they said, look, a lot of our vendors are our customers as well. I can't go around waving a stick at them and threatening them to provide responses back, to respond in a timely fashion, because I'm caught between a bit of a rock and a hard place. And that's probably something that's shared with quite a few of the people on this call, right? That work within the financial service sector, that they can't really, be too heavy-handed, right? So it's a balance. It's a balance.
I think one thing I was going to add very quickly was around, because I like the option around B and D, which was around SolarWinds and customers and investors. Interestingly, one of the things we saw a lot of during the SolarWinds incident was board members asking questions around what CISOs and security teams were doing around SolarWinds, and asking them to run off and go and find a response. And I don't know, Christian, if you kind of experienced some of that, but certainly some of the CISOs we spoke to would kind of say, but we don't even use SolarWinds. But I still had to go off and do a full piece around it, around the fact that we don't use it, and we're still covered around vulnerabilities, and we do this for our third parties, and this is our approach. So I think some of these things that happen from an incident perspective catch board members' views, and then they go and hassle the teams around that.
Thank you very much, guys. I'll just go and launch our third and final poll question of the session, which is, has your organisation considered changing the way it conducts third-party risk assessments since the start of COVID-19? So the options are A, yes, we're in the process of or have updated our approach in the past year. B, no, but we will be reviewing soon. Or C, no, we are satisfied with our current process. So that's just gone live now. And I'll bring it back to the discussion. So Max, so obviously you alluded to it in your opening presentation, but what kind of are the ways that organisations you tend to see them assess security of third-party suppliers, and what are the main kind of issues and challenges that arise from that?
I mean, it's very much what I alluded to before, right? I mean, I'd say the vast majority of companies are still using spreadsheets. They're still adopting a one-to-one strategy, which is, unscalable, right? I mean, you've got two options. You can throw a lot of bodies, right, at the challenge, or leverage technology. And we all have limited resources one way or another. So the crown jewel concept, right, of focusing on the strategics, because you only have so many people who can spend so much time on this topic, limits you. And I think we'll all agree that the majority of the risk in the medium to long tail. So it's predominantly spreadsheet driven. There's some form of internal or inherent risk questionnaire that kicks the process off. Spreadsheets are sent out, spreadsheets come back in, those responses are scored in some fashion, and then you ultimately get a residual risk score that is remediated again on a one-to-one basis, and that then typically is going to roll up into a GRC tool or a purpose-built third-party risk management platform that's been set up to manage multiple risk domains, right? Because what we're talking about here is one of many, right? So there's this topic can be replicated within the bribery and corruption space, financial stability, business, it goes on and on and on, right? So it's it's spreadsheets, it's manual, it's moment in time. We all know that risk isn't a moment in time activity. The inherent risk of a company, it changes every single day. It depends on what's going on out in the threat landscape, right? It's not just, the responses to questions that were completed on, December 2019, right? It's an ongoing, and likewise, your residual risk is influenced by what's going on out in the wild. So that static approach versus a dynamic approach, an agile approach is what it is, right? I mean, it's I think that everybody's looking to try and drive more efficiency into these processes. They're all trying to manage risk. I think that the only activity that's worse than answering a questionnaire, and some of these things are monsters, right? It's the only thing worse than that is chasing somebody up for their answers. It's soul destroying, right? It really is. And to everybody, not a single person have I ever spoken to has said, "Oh, I love it. I love completing questionnaires. Oh, it's great." They don't. And all we're saying is, look, guys, there is a better way to get that data, right? So that's there are multiple different ways, as I explained, to try and get some of that data set and reduce the time, that time investment, and actually get down to the fun stuff, which is remediating, right? Retiring risk, having conversations with your vendors, and so yeah, long-winded response, but yeah, it's the usual spreadsheet versus 21st century solution.
Absolutely, yeah. And Manoj, if I could come to you, like, how much do you expect kind of software solutions to be playing a much bigger role in third-party assessments going forward?
I think they certainly have their place, and I think it's really important. I think back to the process behind that, and it's the process behind any tech solution. I think I'm sure Max would agree with me in the sense that we've got to have a structure, a process, and a thought around what we want to do with that tech solution before we just put tech solutions in. I think that's really important. We're starting to see an industry, kind of start to think about that. Instead of buying tech for the sake of tech, we're seeing a lot more people thinking about the outcomes they want to get from that technology solution. So I think, James, I think it's definitely on the cards. I think tech is certainly going to help us. We're seeing that across the industry around, more artificial intelligence being used and, various different tools. Listen, I think during the pandemic, people have been utilizing EDR and MDR solutions, and XDR is coming down the line, and there's lots of exciting things happening. I think the reality is we've got to make sure, though, that we have the processes, and back to Christian, the points you were making, the outcomes of what you're trying to achieve, and then making sure that the tech solution fits into what you're trying to do as part of that. I think that's really the key thing.
Yeah, definitely. We're only one part of what is probably quite a complex and detailed supply chain management process. So as Max mentioned, we're kind of also interested in modern slavery compliance, anti-bribery, procurement activities, contractual kind of stability, and all that great stuff. So it all features into kind of a broader supplier due diligence bit. As Manoj said, if you haven't got that process bit that you're aligned with your procurement teams, your risk teams, your buying community, so just the people who actually kind of want the thing in the first place, all of that needs to come together. You need to then understand that process, the tolerance of risk in those areas. And if you can't deal with this kind of security element in isolation, because it has a broader impact of putting the business lens on it, the business needs to manage supply chain, okay? Whether that's security, whether that's kind of modern slavery compliance, or actually driving diversity and inclusion initiatives through its supply chain, or whatever the flavor is that kind of needs to go out there. We can't do this in isolation.
Thank you, Christian. We've got quite a few questions in from our audience, so I'll just start going through that as we enter the last 15 minutes. So one of the questions is, are you aware of any data on NPOs or NGOs experiencing breaches, particularly those receiving funding from philanthropy and governments and conducting work in agriculture and energy? So quite a specific question. I'll just throw that out there. Has anyone kind of got any thoughts on that particular?
Not any data I can cite the person to, but in my experience working with a couple of universities in particular, outside of or pre-Pinsent Masons, their kind of use of kind of high performance computing around agriculture and energy research areas was kind of a big area of focus. And the idea being the universities had the kind of the know-how, the smart and the tech, and big industry wanted to kind of capitalize on that. And it was surprising that kind of there was a massive delta between the security expectations of those kind of research bodies and actually what was being asked of by private sector effectively. It led to then the private sector doing some pro bono work for the research areas that actually then highlighted that a number of interested APTs were already planted in and around this kind of high performing network, and obviously kind of sent up a load of red flags, not only on the work they were looking to commission, but actually also on the legacy work that had gone underway. And I think it's a real big concern, or certainly an area that needs to kind of have a light shone quite brightly at it.
I think just to add to that, James, I was going to say we've got a few customers that are in the charity sector, and we're certainly seeing for some of those organisations, we're seeing targeted security attacks, and we are seeing you could call them the kind of the low DDoS attacks rather than the full blown DDoS attacks to try and take websites down and take down funding mechanisms. So we're seeing more and more of that over the last year. And we're also seeing, particularly around some of the other organisations, I think around the philanthropy, saying it is easy enough.
I struggle with it as well.
But I think interestingly for that, it's not just an IT problem. We're seeing those sorts of organisations having their individuals targeted through things like social engineering, and that has really been an increase over the last year or so. So interestingly, we are seeing, but I think we're seeing increased attacks anyway across the industry, but we're seeing very targeted specifically around the charity sectors and the NGOs.
Thank you very much. Another question has come in. Is something I think Christian kind of alluded to earlier. But Max, if I could perhaps throw this your way. The question is, how confident are people currently with the level of assurance or oversight gained of fourth, fifth, etc. party providers further down the supply chain from the current questions asked of third parties?
That's a really tough one. We just we're focused on third party. I mean, when you start bringing in fourth and fifth, it's this right to audit question, right? It's we can address it to a degree via an exchange. You can kind of understand some synergies or some leveraging a large data set, but that's a difficult one. I mean, around assurance on fourth and fifth party, where you have no right to ask the questions and no right to, ask for evidence that validates the assertions that fourth party or fifth party have made. It's that's a really tough one. Fourth parties have been talked about and nth parties have been talked about for a long time, but I've yet to really see a neat solution that is non-intrusive and prohibitively expensive, quite frankly.
Yeah,
no problem.
I think it's balancing that risk. I mean, how concerned are you, firstly, about that fifth party? You might have kind of sufficient contract clauses in place that, the contract requirements should flow down, and therefore the responsibility is on the fourth party or third party that's engaging those to ensure they've got kind of a clear and kind of competent way to assess that. You've then, I guess, got the sort of how do you put it? You've got your risk piece kind of dealt with around kind of contract acceptance, but we find, and having a dedicated team for supply chain risk, it's almost like a mini consulting group for our supply chain, that when we do find ourselves stepping over the third into the fourth and fifth and so on, that actually we're kind of bringing those people with it as well, because the chances are they need that help to kind of get them up there, and which is one of the reasons why we track the time that is spent by that team, because obviously supplier assurance will go so far, but actually it's more, I think, trying to hold them back on the greater good to just try and fix everybody's problems. But we also then find that if you've got entities that are in fourth and fifth and further on in that supply chain, the chances are they're smaller niche providers trying to deliver something, and actually probably that's where your bigger risk is. So we're finding ourselves having to just invest some time with them on a kind of bit of pro bono consultancy. Actually, it's look, for the greater good, they mess up, that comes back to us, if we don't feel that the third party has sufficient oversight or assurance.
Thank you, Christian. So okay. I've got another one specifically aimed at Max, so I'll sort of throw that your way. So the question is, one of the issues with multiple choice questions and yes, no only questions is that it's relatively straightforward for suppliers to give answers that the assessor clearly wants to see without offering any supporting information. And how does your platform manage that?
Yeah, we have comment boxes.
Okay.
So if they want to add some additional information, they can do so in the comment box.
Excellent, thank you, Max. Manoj, I got a question in. Given the highly integrated nature of modern supply chains, is there really such thing as a third party anymore?
No, and I saw that, and I think that's a very valid point. I think back to Christian, something you mentioned around follow the data and look at the risks. I think there'll be some organizations where those lines are very, very blurred, and you become a part of an organization. And if we think about security services just as an isolated view, your sub-scene provider might be an external third party, but they are as much as part of your team as they are as part of anything else. So I think that's a very valid point. I think those lines are blurred. I think that's a very great point to make. And I think, interestingly, for me, it's about, back to what you were talking about, Christian, follow the data and assess the data and see what that kind of what that brings.
Yeah, I think it feels a lot more kind of partnership led now with the work we do. I think it only really will come out if something goes wrong and you're in a court of law defending against the fact it wasn't our fault, it was theirs. they're clearly a third party in that case.
Yeah, that's fair.
Or friendships and relationships will go out the window. But I think it's more how people are working now. It is more of a kind of partnership approach with stuff, and actually it's vendors have helped kind of move the dial on that, so it's a lot more seamless. And I think that's the working relationship we find ourselves in. But yeah, bet your bottom dollar when things go wrong and the courts get involved, or law enforcement, or an insurance claim, yeah, third parties, clearly that's where they are.
Excellent, thank you. Got another question, which is, do you have thoughts on assessing and managing risk for open source third parties, such as libraries downloaded from GitHub? Would any of you guys like to tackle that one? Yeah, go for it.
I don't mind. I'll go in. It's kind of going to be a similar answer, I'm afraid. So it's kind of the risk your business feels that it is exposed to open source material. What's it going to do? So it doesn't change the fact whether it's open sourced or kind of private entity or crowdsourced, wherever that kind of content or support comes from. It's about where your risk profile is. Obviously, if you're kind of taking data out of kind of open source repos, there needs to be an element of kind of code cleansing, scanning, something that goes in there that validates that. Certainly if it's going into production, to products, to support your business, to do that blindly just doesn't feel right. But ultimately, that might be something you're actually okay with because you've been able to get some assurance from maybe the contributors in there or the nature of your business model. Actually, that doesn't pose too much of a risk and you're okay with that. I know it's something we probably wouldn't do, and we would certainly look to put steps in place to manage that risk. Yeah, we probably wouldn't expect the open source entity to complete the process and kind of go through the questionnaires, but actually it's more about due diligence on that support.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that, and I think the key thing here that we've talked about historically has been around cultural transformation. We talk about cultural transformation and security awareness across the organization, but actually it's really important for development teams to be part of that journey so that they can actually assess that risk that you talked about, Christian. So actually getting them on board, understanding the risks of what they're doing from taking code from GitHub and other repos that they might be taking that from, but essentially assessing and assuring that as an organization to make sure that you're confident that it doesn't have the bugs or the backdoors that you're expecting. So I think that's really where that cultural transformation and taking everybody on that journey back to not thinking about it from a security only perspective, but actually thinking about it from a wider business context, I think makes the job a lot easier.
Thank you, Manoj. As we're sort of very near the end now, I'll check our answers to the third and final poll question, which was, has your organisation considered changing the way it conducts third-party risk assessment since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic? So nearly half said yes, we're in the process of or have updated our approach in the past year. That was 43%. This was followed by no, we are satisfied with our current process, which was 31%. And no, but we will be reviewing soon was a quarter of you, which was 25%. Max, perhaps I'll get your thoughts on those responses.
Yeah, I mean, look, the COVID hasn't necessarily been it's been a driver of business to CyberGRX, but we haven't necessarily seen, a spike as a result of COVID. The biggest kind of driver for us, without a doubt, is remediation and backlogs, right? Which is kind of goes to the point of, why we're on the presentation, or the name of the presentation, right? Which is basically it's a headache. Limited resources mean that you have to focus on a subset of your supply chain, and then all of a sudden, there's a compelling event happens, and you've got to quickly, assess thousands of suppliers because they fall below a spend limit that was relevant at a point in time. So I wouldn't say that it is a massive driver, of course. More people, attack surfaces have increased with more, people working at home, etc. But and it's certainly brought, I'd say over the past 12 months, we've had several events that have brought this topic to the forefront again. But it's one of many drivers behind the need to or the desire to drive some efficiency into this data acquisition conversation.
Thank you very much. We're very short on time now. I'll just squeeze one more audience question in. So the question is, based on your experience, what do you consider missteps with regard to third-party contracts? Manoj, do you take that one?
I'm going to keep it really short and sweet. I think the basics. I still think the basics are not followed by a lot of organisations. So I think when you're assessing third parties, I think focusing on a lot of the basics, I think are really important, and making sure that they're in place.
Excellent. Christian, any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, so probably two things you'd want to make sure that are in there. One is the right to audit clause. I think we've emphasised quite a bit during the last kind of 50 minutes, making sure that, look, it needs to be in there, because that's the sort of thing the regulators will be looking for if they're kind of coming at you from an enforcement point of view. Also to then look at the security schedule. So look at what your expectations are. To just put something kind of generic in there, to be certified, to have this, to have that, isn't going to stand up in court. And to be fair, it's probably going to do more harm confusing that third or fourth party. Be explicit in what you're asking them to do. Don't just throw in kind of Annex A from one of ISOs or a copy of a framework that you found online. Be specific in the ask. So therefore, your third party business partner will know what it is that's expected of them, and they can understand as to whether or not they're going to accept that or not.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So really interesting contributions. I feel like could have gone on a lot longer as well. But our thanks to Manoj, Max and Christian for your insights this afternoon. Thank you as well to CyberGRX, Telstra Purple and Telstra Ventures for their sponsorship of this webinar. For details on upcoming webinars, please see our website. And remember, you can rate the session. You can tell us what you liked and if there's anything that you think we can improve upon. Apart from that, thank you everyone for listening today. And this session is now ending.
Thanks.
Thank you.